Hey everybody, Doc T here, and welcome to another episode of Horse Advocate podcast. I love reading these articles that come to horse owners that are full of science and maybe some misinformation. And I'm going to make this a regular staple here. One of the things that I love reading about is uh, highly technical articles, and I want to just jump in and give some insights that might make you think that, wow, maybe there's more to this article, or maybe they're excluding things. So I'm in the Horse magazine, your guide to equine health care. My eyes and my brain are connected. Hold on. There's an article here called Understanding Calcium and Phosphorus Ratios, or they say Understanding Ca and P Ratios. The subtitle is The Delicate Balance Between Two Key Minerals in Horses' Diets. It doesn't give an author here. It's just in their nutrition. Oh, it does. Lucille Figueroa. And let me just read some of the article here, and then let me give you my 2 cents. Starts off by saying more than 2,000 mineral species exist in nature, ranging from the sodium and chloride that make up your table salt to expensive diamonds. In the context of nutrition, minerals contribute to hundreds of vital functions in the body, everything from brain activity to heartbeat. Minerals are essential for life, growth, and metabolism. Therefore, it is important to understand not only the amounts your horse requires, but also their intricate relationships with one another. Due to these complex interactions, an excess or deficiency of one mineral can impair the absorption and utilization of others. All these statements are true. And minerals are what if you've ever been to a cremation, or a friend or a family member has been have been passed away, and their bodies cremated in a furnace, you'll find that there's not much left. Most of us are gases: nitrogen, oxygen, helium, hydrogen. Helium's a laughing gas. And most of that just goes off in the atmosphere. And what's left is some carbon and calcium and other minerals that are not much of us. So they're important, but they don't hold a lot of volume in us. Our bones are probably the most expansive amount of visible mineral content in the form of calcium. But sodium chloride, which makes up salt, is also expansive. It's just in solution running through our bodies and stored within cells. And of course, potassium is another one in there, and phosphorus. And it's just, it seems like we can understand sugar because it's being there in our spoon, putting in our coffee. So we can understand that. We can understand protein when you look at any sort of meat. Hard to see protein in a pile of peas, but sugar and fat, of course, everyone can see fat, but minerals, we just can't see them. We see them in a picture of a rock. We say, oh yeah, there's minerals. And then from there, we kind of get confused because so little of it is needed. How it gets into our bodies is kind of complex. But this article is just about calcium and phosphorus, two of the minerals. So let me read on. In horses, this notoriously applies to two very important macro minerals, calcium and phosphorus. An inverted ratio, more phosphorus than calcium, in the diet can cause serious health problems. The good news is, if your horse is currently eating adequate amounts of forage, as well as a ration balancer or concentrate appropriate for his life stage and activity levels, this calcium to phosphorus ratio is most likely just fine. But let's find out. So what does that sentence say? The most important part is the good news is if your horse is currently eating adequate amounts of forage, just stop right there. Further on in this article, I have to turn the page here. They have a graph. I have to turn 2 pages, 3 pages. There's a graph in here someplace. Where did here it is. Table 2, where it lists the calcium and phosphorus percentages in various things. It has mare's milk, where it's virtually 10 to 1 calcium to phosphorus. Beet pulp, where it's almost 9 to 1. Alfalfa hay, which is, let's see, 5 to 1. Red clover hay, 5 to 1. Fescue hay and Timothy hay and coastal Bermuda grass hay are all basically 2 to 1, give or take, maybe, but certainly more than 1 to 1. It's like 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1. Orchard grass hay is 1 to 1. It's 0.32 to 0.30%. So orchard grass hay is still higher in calcium. And then they get into the grains: barley, cracked corn, rolled oats, rice bran, and wheat bran. And all of them are much higher, significantly higher in phosphorus than the calcium. So this is an interesting article. So calcium and phosphorus both play an important role in your horse's health, according to this article. His bones and teeth contain almost 99% of the calcium in the body. So why do bones have most of the calcium? When in reality, calcium is necessary for every muscle contraction that you do, from your eyelids blinking, your fingers moving, the hooves stretch out and gallop. Calcium is very important for that. So why is it mostly stored in the body? So let me cut through some of the chase here. Your blood calcium levels have to be maintained at a strict level in your blood. Whenever you draw a blood sample of an animal, that calcium level is going to be right there. It can vary just slightly above and below, but if it gets too far above or too far below that normal, you go into a coma and you die. And the way that's how critical calcium is in your body. And the way to manage that is through a hormone mechanism from something called the parathyroid gland that has parathyroid hormone that balances the calcium that's coming into your mouth to the calcium levels in your blood. If you have too little calcium coming into the blood is going to go to the bones and suck the calcium out to maintain your blood levels. And if you have too much calcium in your diet, then the calcium is going to be stored in your bones until it's maxed out, and then it's excreted. So calcium is very important and tightly regulated in all animals. When you don't have enough calcium and they start to suck the calcium out of your bones, the bones now turn to softer material, basically the cartilage or the matrix that the calcium is stored in, and the bones become soft. This is called nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, which is a big mouthful. So if you want to call it the common name, it's rickets. And rickets is the softening of the bones, which leads to pain, actually. And then at some point, there's not enough calcium left in the body, and they become hypocalcemic. You have muscle cramps, you have seizures, you have comas, and you have death. So what happened? A little history that's not in this article is when the Industrial Revolutions came around, which is, the late 1800s, early 1900s, more and more people found that it was better or easier or more profitable to live in a city, and people started to move into more communal groups, um, leaving their farms behind. And up until that time, almost everybody who had a home also had a garden and also hunted. And they consisted on the foods that they took care of, that they grew. And some more industrious people would take fields and grow them and make hay or grains. And then they would turn the grains into flour and they would make their bread or their pasta. And life was good until we moved to the city when we didn't have a plot of grass anymore or ground. And so we didn't have our gardens. So we depended on farmers, and farmer stature in life became more and more important to the survival of our species. Uh, and to do that, remember, we didn't have tractors back then. We had plow horses. They plowed the ground and they cultivated it and they harvested and they pulled the wagons that put all that grain and everything else out of the field into the factories where they were bagged and shipped out to the cities where bread was made and people became happy. So the horse actually was called into more and more service. They were actually worked harder because they had more work to do. And to do that, the millers, and the millers are the people who actually milled the grain. They went out and harvested the grains, brought it in, milled it into flour, bagged it, and shipped it out. The millers started to notice something happening in their horses. And it was originally called Miller's disease. And what that turned out to be was rickets. Now, why did these horses start to get Miller's disease? It's simple. These horses, being worked harder and harder, were being fed grain. This is how horses ended up eating grain. They were worked. And because of their workload, they became too thin. So the obvious thing is we'll feed them some more sugar because they're consuming that sugar in their daily exercise. And that sugar would be converted into energy in the body, and the horse would continue to move. I will give you a sidebar here. I love sidebars because sidebars have absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but are still of an interesting point and are relevant to what we're talking about. These plow horses were fed every morning their grain meal, and then they would go out and plow their fields and harvest their grains and haul bags, wagons filled with bags into the city. And they had multiple uses, and everybody had a whole barn full of horses. And that's when the veterinarian was really talented in their horsemanship skills, but the horse owner was equally talented and prevented a lot of these diseases from occurring. But on Sunday, it was a God's day, and they would have a day of rest. Well, the problem is they would go out and feed their horses this full grain load, and they weren't worked that day. And this would cause an inflammation in the muscles that would break down the muscles into a product that was excreted from their body through their urine. And the urine actually would turn black, or what they call coffee colored. So these horses had coffee colored urine. It was also called azoturia. It was also called tying up. And these horses would suffer incredible cramps from, and if it was bad enough, clog up the kidneys to the point that they actually died because the myositis was the inflammation of the muscles was breaking down, and these byproducts were going into the kidneys, and just like a kitchen strainer get clogged with stuff, and so the kidneys no longer worked. And it's called Monday morning disease or tying up. And these farmers had to learn not to feed their horse on the Sunday that they weren't working, because on Monday they would have a bunch of sick horses and even dead horses. So grain, everybody had to learn how to use grain. And that was one of the things that occurred. But let's go back to these horses are now being fed a lot of grain. And they had high levels of phosphorus. As I read to you off of there, the phosphorus to calcium ratio was more in favor of phosphorus. It became more of an inverted ratio, as they called it. So what happens when that happens? Well, when you have high levels of phosphorus, it competes for the absorption of calcium. So the horse is eating a lot of grain, and they would get the calcium coming in from the hays, but they weren't being absorbed because now we had higher levels of phosphorus. So the horses would start to absorb calcium from their bones, and they would get rickets. And that's where somebody had to do something. They had to keep the horse's energy up. So they're feeding a bunch of grain, which, by the way, is a falsehood, because grain doesn't actually create energy in the horse. It's a poor form of fuel, where fat is the preferred and more efficient fuel in the muscle. But that will require giving the horse more turnout time on the pasture, eating structural carbohydrates that turn into fat. And nobody want to do that. They want to keep these horses housed in a stall and ready to go the next day, because, hey, time is money. And as soon as the sun came up, you had to have the horses out there working to get all the grain that these city dwellers wanted. So now these horses are being worked hard and fed a lot of grain, high in phosphorus, and they were slowly resorbing their calcium. And at some point, they found that the horse was suffering from Miller's disease, which is rickets, and that horse had to be taken out of service and put back on pasture and taken off grain. But that's not efficient. That's not how you use a horse. So some brilliant individual said, hey, let's add more calcium to their grain. So they said, okay, what can we add to food that would increase the amount of calcium that would counteract this high phosphorus ratio? So they ended up with adding a couple ingredients, one of which is called dicalcium phosphate, which is 2 calciums to 1 phosphorus. And they found that it wasn't toxic to horses. And they said, this is a great way to add calcium. So they did that. And now on every bag of grain and every ration balancer you ever buy, you can look at the ingredients tag and you're going to see dicalcium phosphate. And you also see monocalcium phosphate, which I find interesting, because why are they putting in 1 calcium, 1 phosphorus? It's always confused me. And then, as it says in the article, they added, what did they add? Calcium carbonate. And in the article, they say calcium carbonate is a form of calcium that they're adding. But I just look at it as Tums. Tums is an antacid, and calcium carbonate is an antacid. And the more grain you feed to a horse, the more acidic his intestines, specifically the stomach, will be. So they have to add an antacid to their grains, but they don't tell you that in this article. They just say it's a calcium source, which I find fascinating. It's a little nuance, but why are you adding Tums to my horse's feed? Anyway, so they added dicalcium phosphate, and I think I said in this article, it said you need to be adding a ration balancer. Well, ration balancers, yeah, as well as a ration balancer or concentrate appropriate for his life stage. I love that, appropriate for his life stage. And I tell people all the time, when they tell me that they're feeding a senior feed to their horses, I'm like, okay, let's go for a walk. I say, we'll take as much time as you want, go all day if you want, and we'll walk anywhere you want. And we're going to be looking for senior feeds for squirrels. And the look of just like, laughter comes on the person's face, because we all know there's no senior feeds for squirrels. There's no senior feeds for raccoons. There's no senior feed for birds or fish. There's no senior feeds for anything out there. The only thing comes close is the senior menu for old people at restaurants where they have a better price. But it's not like we have senior steak, like it's different or something. But they have these senior feeds that everybody feels like they should put their horse on a senior feed. And I'm like, so when does your horse become a senior? I mean, what's the age that your horse is now considered a senior? And I've seen it as low as 12. Some people are feeding senior feeds to 12-year-olds. And I'm like, wow, what happened to the 20, 25, 30-year-olds? Aren't those seniors? And I find it fascinating because our nutritional needs change over time based on our sedentary lifestyle of an older person, older horse. But they don't change as far as the materials you're putting in the mouth as raw food. So I find the whole idea of having a senior feed for horses comical. And yet it's a marketing thing that's come out. I haven't seen senior feeds in any other species. And yet we gobble them up, pun intended. And when we look at the ingredients of these senior feeds, it's throwaways from the human food industry, such as the outer shell of wheat, known as wheat middlings, outer shell of rice, known as rice bran, outer shell of soybeans called soybean hulls, outer shell of oats called oat hulls. I mean, they put all the garbage that they don't want to throw out into a bag, put a pretty picture on it, and call it a senior feed, and we buy it. Or I don't buy it, but a lot of people do, where actually all those ingredients have the lectins, those plant proteins that can be inflammatory and are inflammatory for most horses. And I have some people who say, yeah, my horse has the squirts, they defecate and that fecal water comes out. And all they have to do is get off these inflammatory foods and that fecal water goes away. But going back to calcium phosphorus ratios, the feed companies are dumping in calcium at a higher level to counteract the high phosphorus of grains. And yet grains are adding to the starch that's creating metabolic syndrome in horses. Grains are unnecessary because they can get plenty of starch from their pasture and from their hay that you're feeding them. And unless you're plowing with your horses and doing extreme work, do they actually need any of these grains? And if you remove all the grains, the calcium phosphorus ratio immediately balances itself out. So you don't have to be adding any of these calcium phosphorus things. But the one thing's interesting, I read this article all the way through. I think I'll be more honest with you. I choked my way through this. And I found it fascinating. Here's the take-home message. They always love the and take home, because we gave you all the science, but now here's what you really need to know. It says, given the possible health consequences of feeding an inadequate calcium phosphorus ratio, it's not something that you want to leave up to chance. But their table said all forages have an adequate calcium phosphorus ratio. So what chance are you taking? It says, thankfully, a forage-based diet supplemented with either a concentrate or ration balancer generally offers appropriate levels of both minerals. But if you're not feeding a concentrate ration or a balancer, you don't need to add these minerals. They're only talking about a ratio. They're not talking about the total amount of calcium and phosphorus they actually need. They're just talking about a ratio. And if the ratio of phosphorus is higher than calcium, it's going to suck the calcium out of the bones and give your horse rickets and other metabolic problems, such as cramps and seizures. So I'm thinking, okay, what's the deal here? Well, it turns out that most of this information is coming out from a major grain company, but we won't go there. Ration balancers, I wrote about in my blog called Betrayal. Because in this quote unquote ration balancer, it gets into two things that I find hilarious. First is in the ration balancer, they'll add soybean meal, which is my favorite source of protein, which is a soybean that's had its oil removed and its hulls removed. And then further in the ration balancer, it'll have soybean oil added back in. Now, what's interesting about soybean oil, as in all oils from seeds or vegetables, is that they're high in the omega-6 fatty acids, or the precursors to omega-6 fatty acids, which we all know contribute to the inflammatory pathway. And as we do need some omega-6s, we all need some omega-6s that should never be eliminated. Adding soybean oil is one of the most inflammatory and prolific causes of inflammation in humans. And so I'm just going to assume that it's also inflammatory for horses. And the reason why they have to add soybean oil is to lubricate their machines that make the pellet, because if it's not lubricated, the machines just grind to a halt. So they have to add back a food oil, and they've taken it out of their soybean meal over here, and they put it back into their food over here to lubricate the machine. And I really don't care about your horse. So there. That's the one thing. And then the second is something called lignin sulfonate. And I see this in a lot of ration balancers. And I said, what the heck is lignin sulfonate? So I looked it up, and its primary use is for dust control on dirt roads. Secondary use is for it's an additive in concrete and sheetrock. Third use is to create a slurry, a lubricant for well drilling in our earth, lignin sulfonate. Fourth is a precursor to DMSO, which, by the way, I think is the best medicine on the planet for multiple reasons, but that's a whole nother blog or podcast. And then fifth is an antioxidant for fire retardants and animal feed. So throwing in this lignin sulfonate in your ration balancer and saying, yeah, it's fine for your horse. And like, but they don't need balancing in anything. Just feed them forage and they will balance themselves. But I digress. Okay. Your role as the horse's owner is to consider the overall diet, select the appropriate feed for his life stage and lifestyle, and ensure you are feeding the correct amounts. Again, I go back. Is your horse carrying cannons, pulling cannons over mountains into battles? Is he plowing fields? Is he hauling freight into the cities? I mean, I know some of your horses work hard. I know that there are some horses in training. I guess the best to think about would be a racehorse or an endurance horse, and even horses that are used within rings often work hard. But I don't think they're working as hard as all day pulling a plow or logging logs out of forests. Or, I mean, I can list a dozen different activities that probably the horse ends up working more. But I don't think that that's happening. I don't believe that you need to change the feed because your horse has moved into a senior category, or that it needs a different food because it's a youngster. All horses need is what's growing on the ground, and it's going to provide them all the calcium and phosphorus that they need in the proper and appropriate ratios. As always, veterinarians and nutritionists are there to help you with these decisions. Well, that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to help you. You don't have to be feeding grains, and you don't have to be feeding ration balancers to get the calcium phosphorus ratio correct. But I found interesting, many of you know that people are now using magnesium. They're adding magnesium to calm their horses. And some of these feed companies are adding magnesium to the feeds that they're having to offset one little problem that everyone isn't telling you. Calcium and phosphorus and magnesium are critical and essential elements that need to be imported into the bloodstream or into the body to get proper balance, if you will, lack of better term. seeing that we're all saying equine ration balancers. And that when you increase the amount of calcium and phosphorus abnormally by adding grain and then adding dicalcium phosphate, monocalcium phosphate, calcium carbonate, when you're adding these things, it prevents the horse from absorbing magnesium. And what's fascinating is the number one sign of a magnesium deficiency in a horse is, I've got to do, if you're watching this, I'll make it hyperexcitability. The horse becomes jittery, nervous, unfocused. It's all signs of magnesium deficiency. So all the owners are adding magnesium back in to calm their horse down. Whereas if they took away all this excess calcium phosphorus that they're feeding their horse, the magnesium would normalize and everything would be fine. So bet you they tell they did. Oh, I know they didn't tell you that in this article on calcium phosphorus. They don't tell you this anywhere, and it's a common fact. So that's my whole story on calcium phosphorus ratios. It's why I'm here helping you guys interpret some of these articles that come in magazines that you might want to read and understand. And you might say, wow, calcium phosphorus ratios need to be normal. We need to add a ration balancer, or make sure our grains have this dicalcium phosphate in there to make sure that our calcium phosphorus ratios are normal. And that's not the truth. The truth is your horse needs forage, ground-based plants. That's how they were created. They convert their cellulose into fat. They take the starch, so they have the sugar in their fat. They have a broad variety of protein, or ground plants, they'll have their broad variety of proteins, which in our day age of having horses, they don't have that broad variety. But as far as the minerals go, the minerals are coming in through their plants. And I hear this all the time. Oh, the plants don't have it because they're overgrazed and hay is over processed and the ground is deplete of minerals. And I'm like, well, your number one source of minerals actually is water. If it's pumped from the ground, it's loaded with minerals. Another source is that Himalayan salt block, or the Redmond salt block, or some sort of block of salt that's been mined from the earth. It has all the minerals it needs. And then calcium phosphorus ratios, according to this chart, seems to be plentiful. And they're not going to be losing it. If they do through sweat, add the salt lake, it'll bring back all the elements that they need, the minerals. Because remember, all minerals become electrolytes through the gain or loss of electrons. So electrolytes are basically minerals. But some people are adding electrolytes, which are basically minerals, which is just fascinating to me. So no, I don't think horses need to be added any extra minerals as long as they're having water and they have a salt lick and they're having adequate forage. So that's just my take. Whether you believe it or not, of course, that's up to you. You have to do your due diligence and look around and get as much information as you can from other sources and compare it. But show me a horse that has a mineral deficiency, and I want to know about it, because it just doesn't seem to be that evident due to chelation of minerals that allows the mineral to be absorbed. The horse will regulate what minerals it needs in its body and will not absorb minerals it doesn't need. So those, again, are tightly regulated. So that's it. Again, another podcast going into the records here. I appreciate you all being here. Please pass these things on. Become a member of the Horses Advocate. The Horses Advocate is a source of information that's unbiased. I just want to do the right thing for the horse. Using the 50 years of experience I've had with horses, just under 50 years, listening to people, seeing with my own eyes what works, what doesn't work. And I'm just trying to pass it on to you. If you like what we do here, please consider becoming a member of the Horses Advocate. That gives you access to forums where we can all ask each other's questions and build off of everybody's experience. I join in there all the time to see what's going on. and give my feedback and answer any questions that you have. So please come to the Horse Advocate, check it out. I'm grateful for all of you being here and listening to this podcast. And I look forward to hearing or putting out more of these to help horses thrive in a human world. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There are two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.